Wednesday, 10:40 a.m. Coral enters through the back door, looking like a pie with sauce, dressed in her tan parachute with a red corsage. She looks as if she's been ready since dawn as well. The older you get, the earlier you get ready for appointments. My mother is tizzed up as well. Her hair is rather like Samantha Stevens in Bewitched. It curls up so high at the ends you could store pencils where it bends up at the sides. I've never been to a funeral before. I've heard stories of people jumping on coffins as they're being lowered into the plot, but I've never seen it for myself. I'd hate grief to grip me and make me do things I have no control over. When naturalistic plays came to our school, I always giggled if there was a highly charged emotional scene. I find unbridled emotion embarrassing. Since it's only Mrs. Sharko, I don't expect I'll be too upset. I just hope I can control whatever emotions do rise to the surface. I made a decision in Year 9 to be as laid back as possible, no matter what the circumstances. This funeral will be a good test. 11 a.m. The funeral is at a modern-looking church with sandstone feature walls, candy-coloured windows, and a groovy pastor with a goatee who uses street talk 5 years out of date. The Melvies are there, the Sorensens, Lexi 2 and 3, and others. "Sore neck," says Coral as we wait to be seated. "What?" I say. "Your head's at a funny angle," she says. At first, I don't know what she's talking about, and I give her a duh. However, I quickly realised the moment I saw Lexi 3, I looked up to make my eyes appear bigger, so my head is at a funny angle. I didn't even know I was doing it. Since people are probably more vulnerable at funerals, I suppose it's not a bad time to flirt. I know it sounds macabre, but maybe natural disasters, civil unrest, and funerals are the best places to start a long-term relationship. 11:05 a.m. Mr. Sharko arrives in a black car. His head is stoically upright as he enters the church, but emotionally he's staring at the ground. He looks far off, like he's watching TV in Peru. Immediately he's seated in the church, the service gets underway. Mrs. Gumley and Dick, who look stunning, dressed in a piercing blue stare, are here, but not Mal or Mr. Gumley. My father's not here either. He must be held up at work. The life of a debit-credit salesman means you're always in other people's hands. Like a city cab driver, you never know where you have to go to make a buck. I can't see Niles. Surely he should be at his mother's funeral. I ask Coral why Niles isn't here. Mr. Price, who's in the pew behind us, obviously overhears, or he practices social osmosis and can absorb other people's thoughts, because he leans in and says Niles won't come because his father and he don't get on. 11:15 a.m. The pastor reads from a white Bible. I find it hard to listen when someone reads. My interest sparks a little when he puts down the Bible and tells us in his own words that Mrs. Sharko was a concert pianist whose career was cut short when she severed a tendon in her index finger. Mr. Price leans forward again and whispers, "She went berserk in Myers, smashed her way out of the crystal department with an axe." It's almost as if he's trying to psych me out. 11:45 a.m. At the end of the service, Mr. Sharko and the pastor stand at the entrance of the church and farewell the mourners. The pastor is smiling, but Mr. Sharko looks very sad. Most mourners stop and chat until the pastor gently lays his hand on their backs and pushes them on. I use the same principle I use when trying to get into a licensed club. If you're not moving, you're not interesting. I can't look at Mr. Sharko. As I said, I don't like unbridled emotion. I find it embarrassing. I move on to the lawn outside the church. Coral's like a bee gathering pollen as she flits between groups of people, inviting them back to her place for the wake. I chat with Lexi 3 and we have the best conversation ever. Why? We have a common focus. That is, Mrs. Sharko's death. 11:55 a.m. I notice Mrs. Gumley and Dick Gumley go over to a brand new car parked opposite the church. I see Mr. Gumley and the Lord Mayor in the front seat. I think it's the Lord Mayor. Why is the Lord Mayor always with Mr. Gumley? There are two people in the back, but from this distance I can't tell who they are. Dick kisses his mother, then gets into the back seat of the car. Danny Connors gets out the other side, stops at the driver's window, says something to Mr. Gumley, then he takes Mrs. Gumley by the arm and walks her back to the Mercedes. 12:15 p.m. The thing about Australian suburbia is the terrain never changes. As we make our way from the church to Coral's place in a convoy of polished cars, one suburb seems identical to the next. Each one has a similar mix of blonde and red brick homes with the odd weatherboard or fibro throwback to create a wedge between those who've stopped progressing and those still moving up. Every suburb has a hill, and there's always a large house on top of it that's hidden by a ring of evergreens. I guess each street has a richest family, and naturally they have the elevated position. As we turn onto Ocean Street, which starts as a narrow tributary on the mountain, white fluffy clouds droop down over the escarpment like a fringe with too much product in it. If that mountain were me, my mother would say, "You need a haircut, buddy." I know if that mountain was on our street, one of our neighbours would go up there with some secateurs and tidy up that overhanging cloud. Maybe we'd send our local barber, Mr. Pepper, up there with his scissors and thin black combs to give it a nice college boy cut. He'd make it look respectable, give it a square back, put a bit of gel on top and offer it a stick of gum when he's finished. 12:45 p.m. Pleasant Avenue is in shade. A small grey cloud hovers directly above us, making it seem colder and greyer than it is. There are more cars in the street than usual as strangers and residents jostle for the parking spots nearest Coral's place. We, being residents with off-street parking, motor straight into our driveway. 12:50 p.m. This is a rare day indeed. All the blinds are up inside Coral's house. Sunlight fills previously dark rooms with fingers of light and shade. There's a distinct golden glow as light filters through the film of dust on all her windows. It feels as if we're inside a glass of beer. I see things I didn't know existed. Even Nev's been swept up and hidden under a rug somewhere. It took death to close Coral's curtains, and it's taken a death to reopen them again. Maybe Coral was only meant to mourn Clive until there was another death in the street, and now there's been another death. She's been released from her burden of grief by the suburban gods. There are plates of sandwiches as far as the eye can see, fields of brown and white bread with bits of green lettuce protruding from their crustless hosts. Coral must have gotten up early to prepare them. This must be like the old days, when Clive and Coral entertained their friends, music piping through speakers in the floor, swapping partners and frosting up car windows parked on the street, or so I'm told. It's easy to forget we're here because a neighbour died. Maybe we're celebrating the fact there's more air for the rest of us to breathe now Mrs. Sharko's gone. Little islands of people begin to form conversations. I wander about, nudging up against them like small waves lapping an atoll. Most conversations start with Mrs. Charcot's death, the common focus, but there's not much to talk about once you discuss Niall's non-attendance, so we drift on to other topics. How much did the new roof cost? How do you think Souths will go this year? I attach myself to Mrs. Sorensen. A comfortable-looking chair, isn't it? I say, patting Clive's unremarkable-looking throne. You get the feeling we're simply using one another, waiting until someone more interesting comes along. This used to be Clive's chair, I mumble. Poor Clive, she says. You'd have known Clive, I say. A little. I barely remember him. Cocky man, she says. What an odd thing to say, I think. I picture him differently than that. I associate the word cocky with little and arrogant. To me, Clive is tall and dashing. Admittedly, my image of Clive is vividly locked in my 12th year. Cocky, I say. Stout. He was tall, I say. He was smaller than Coral, says Mrs. Sorensen. Really, I say. I'll never forget the night he died, she says. We felt the shudder of the explosion in Pleasant Avenue. Explosion, I say. She says. What explosion? When he hit the garbage truck, his brother and him were incinerated. He had a heart attack. He died in this chair, I say. No, they hit a garbage truck. 2 were thrown out through the back window. The 2 brothers were killed. Very sad. Apparently, she stops, looks around to make sure no one's listening. Then she does a drinking gesture. 1:30 p.m. I linger here and there, trying to put myself in the best position so someone can ask me about the Gumleys. I just want to get started. It's always better to be asked to join a conversation than to just join one. When you're asked to join a conversation, someone listens. That is, the person who asked you to join. My lucky break comes when Mrs. Gumley and Danny arrive. The moment they enter, tongues start wagging and questions start flying like shrapnel. I'm desperate for someone to ask me something. Mr. Price is on edge too. You can tell he's excited because his fingers are twitching like a child looking at a cake he can't eat. He's standing with Mrs. Melvey and Mrs. Winter, Lexi Three's mother, chatting away as if they're minor birds at sunset. I bet they're talking about Mrs. Gumley because every few seconds they glance over to where she's standing and refuel their thoughts. Then they turn back and recommence their tattle with full tanks. I smile at Mrs. Melvey. She smiles back. Everyone on Pleasant Avenue is starved for affection, so whenever you smile at someone or wave, you inevitably attract attention. The scent of fresh attention attracts Mrs. Winter. Pleasant Avenuers are like thirsty animals. They can smell attention from miles away. I smile at Mrs. Winter, and finally the opportunity to join a conversation presents itself. I take a deep breath, fill my lungs with enough air to dive deeper than I've dived before, and I join the most important conversation of my life. Sandy? I say. Who's that with Mrs. Gumley? Whispers Mrs. Winter. The blonde driver I was telling Mrs. Melvey about, I say. They're together, are they? Replies Mrs. Winter. He's the minder, I say. She's not allowed to drive, says Mrs. Melvey. She lost her licence when she drove over the traffic island outside the German restaurant. He keeps her out of trouble, I say. Trouble, says Mrs. Winter. They own the illegal casino, replies Mrs. Melvey. Who? The Gumleys. I glance at Mr. Price, wondering when he'll enter the fray. He seems content to let Mrs. Melvey and I fight out the preliminary bout. Mrs. Winter is a perfect straight woman. She just keeps feeding us what we need. Casino, she says. The illegal casino, says Mrs. Melvey. Mr. Price finally enters the ring. Don't you know about the casino? The Vienna restaurant above the laundromat, it's an illegal casino, says Mrs. Melvey, making sure she's still a card-carrying member of the I Know What's Going On club. There's roulette, blackjack, free drinks. Ooh, he's got fingers in a lot of pies, I add. What pies? Ah, the first sign of panic from Mrs. Melvey. I produce my best you'd-be-surprised face, then look straight at Mr. Price. He doesn't disappoint. Not only does he return my you'd-be-surprised face, he raises me with a look of his own and adds, you know, they may have found the plane that's missing in the mountains. I look at him. He can't. No, he can't know what I know. Surely he's got this information off Coral or Nev. He can't possibly know what I know about the plane. Plane? What plane? Oh, thank you, Mrs. Winter. That saves me asking a question. Me asking Mr. Price questions puts him in a position of power. The missing plane may have crashed into the dam, says Mr. Price, looking pleased with himself. This is weird. He's trying to put me out of business with calculated tattle. You know, the plane belongs to an engineering company with the same name as the Gumleys' car yard, says Mrs. Melvey. Mr. Price and I turn to Mrs. Melvey and say, You mean B&L? We look at each other, surprised that we both threw the same punch at the same time. We glance at Mrs. Melvey as if to acknowledge the end of her membership to the I Know What's Going On club, leaving only the keeper of the vine himself and me, head to head, tongue to tongue. I wait. He waits. He looks. I look. I don't think he's got anything left. But a tiny voice inside my head says, Wait a little longer. Let him think he's won. Unfortunately, I'm an only child, and I always do as I please, so I do the opposite. They have found the plane, I say. Mr. Price looks at me. I see panic in his eyes. Who told you that? He snaps. I have my sources. Nev? No. Who? Asio. Asio? Someone at Asio, I say. Who do you know at Asio? He says. Someone? You don't know anyone at Asio? I do. Gee, Mr. Price scratches when he's cornered. How do you know they found the plane? Snaps Mr. Price. He saw it, I say. Now for the killer blow. Concentrate, Sandy. Don't let your eyebrows arch. Nice and relaxed. Poker face. Do you know what it was carrying? I say. You'd think I'd been in the entertainment industry for years the way I'm handling this. What? Says good old Mrs. Winter. Mustard gas. It's just how I imagined it would be. The look on Mr. Price's face. The gasp he makes is like the air rushing from a dying man. What a sublime feeling to have Mrs. Melvey, Mrs. Winter, and the keeper of the vine himself salivating at the prospect of my next sentence, uncomplicated and total fascination of me. It's heaven. I'm the second richest person on Pleasant Avenue. Then, almost as if it's scripted, Danny Connors saunters up next to me and interrupts. Can I see you for a sec, Sandy? As Danny drags me away, I glance back at the tiny island to see my secret ablaze on the tinderbox dry lives of the 3 inhabitants. If you've been in sugarcane country when they're burning cane to prepare it for harvest, you have some idea of what the spectacle is like. Do us a favour, man, says Danny, snapping me from my euphoric state. Look after Deborah. I got to do something. Can you get her home and make sure she doesn't drink and stuff?" He obviously senses my lack of enthusiasm. "Come on, man," he says. "Oh, it was horrible last time," I say. "If she doesn't drink, she's cool as shit." "Why can't she drink?" I say. "Sedatives," he says. "Sedatives?" I say. "You'd be depressed if you belonged to that family, man." "Can't you take her?" I say. "I can't." He stops, like he's told me too much. Then he leaves. For the rest of the wake, I divide my time between Mr. Price, Mrs. Melvey, Mrs. Winter, and Mrs. Gumley. I keep the two factions separate because I don't want to share Mrs. Gumley. She's my secret. But since I also have to make sure the fire I started doesn't get out of control, I can't spend as much time with Mrs. Gumley as I should, and she starts drinking. 2:15 p.m. I lose Mrs. Gumley, only to rediscover her at the side of Coral's house. The heel of her shoe is stuck in a muddy section of Coral's lawn. "Time to go home, Mrs. Gumley," I say. Her eyes are so beautiful, but so full of problems. "No," she snaps, trying unsuccessfully to remove the stiletto from the lawn. "Don't want to go home." Oh, this could turn nasty. She's in a mood. She abandons her stiletto and walks towards the front door, one shoe on, one shoe off. I can't let her go inside. She might take her dress off again. "Stop, Mrs. Gumley," I say. She turns around and stares at me for a second. I'm relieved she's not going inside, but things switch to bizarre as she kicks off her other shoe and begins to dance. At first, it's a small, fluid, sexy dance, her arms moving in a Balinese-style pattern, but after 20 seconds, the aesthetic changes to that of a wino surrounded by a swarm of flying insects. She moves towards me, then around me, like I'm a covered wagon separated from fellow settlers in a cheap western. Around and around she goes, hitching her dress above the undies line, her arm movements becoming more outlandish with each circumnavigation of my bulbous Eastern European frame. I keep still, hoping she won't make too much noise and attract the other mourners. Only my eyes move, but they whir about like an insect being placed in a bug catcher. Suddenly, Lexi 3 emerges from inside Coral's. "You like my dance?" Mrs. Gumley yells. "Shh," I say. "It's nice, Mrs. Gumley," replies Lexi. "Dance," yells Mrs. Gumley. I never dance, but I make an effort, hoping it might calm her down. Should I run? Take her home, or should I go to a flag-in for 5 wild minutes? She starts to sing. "Reuben James, you still walk the thoroughfare of my mind." Yeah. "You don't like my song?" she asks. "We have to go, Mrs. Gumley," I say. I try to get her moving before everyone joins Lexi on the porch and sees this embarrassing display. It's bad enough. Lexi's there. "Hello, neighbours," she trills as we stumble onto Pleasant Avenue. "Like my new boyfriend?" she yells to no one in particular. Behind the oleanders, I can almost hear the sound of slippers and slingbacks shuffling towards the Venetians to take a peek. Every time Danny Connors disappears, Mrs. Gumley falls apart. You feel that Mrs. Gumley has taken a lot of punishment in her life. As she clings on to me, I feel like a trainer helping a former champ off the paddock, a champion who's competed too long, taken too much punishment, and is now playing on memory. How do people get like this? I help Mrs. Gumley up the driveway. We make a camp just below the peak. Then after a short rest, we make the final assault. There are no cars in the drive, so I feel safe helping her to the door. I know where the key is. I saw her get it the other night. I open the door and quickly shut it so she can't get back out. It's like putting an old budgie back in its cage for the last time. Then I run as fast as I can to get as far away as possible in the least amount of time.